Hello, I'm Lisa Burkhardt Worley, and welcome to Pop Talk, the show where you never know what topics might pop up. Pop Talk is sponsored by Prestige Development Properties. 3 years later, we're still talking about COVID and the global pandemic and still trying to decide if COVID happened because of a leak from a Wuhan, China lab or not. Today, we're going to speak to a bioterrorism expert who has written a book about the subject, and maybe by the end of the program, we'll know in our minds, one way or another, if this leak was intentional. But before we introduce our guests, say hello to our Pop Talk co-hosts, Renee Rollins and Michelle Burden.
Yes. Hello.
Hey, it's
Hello.
good to see you guys. Great to be here. Well, our guest today on Pop Talk is Dr. Mark Fulmer. Dr. Fulmer is a retired bioterrorism preparedness coordinator and senior emergency response planner with 20 years experience in local and state government, above my pay grade, by the way. His background also includes disease outbreak investigation and public health epidemiology. Dr. Fulmer also served as a subject matter expert in biological health threats for the North Texas Council of Governments Regional Emergency Preparedness Council. Very important stuff, as you might deduce. Dr. Fulmer is the author of the Wuhan Incident. This is the book, Bioweapons and the Emerging Global Reset. He's now involved in political activism and is the president and founder of Christian Patriots Forum, an organization that provides an engagement platform for Christian constitutional conservatives. So we're glad to have you on Pop Talk, Dr. Fulmer. We met you at a Patriots Academy. Michelle was there, Patriots Academy dinner. I don't believe there are any coincidences in life. You were right there at the same table, and we started talking to you about this and found out about all your credentials and said, boy, we need to have you on the show. And so glad you're here.
Thank you, Lisa, and it's so glad to be here with you on Pop TV today.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And I just want you to take us back to your first thoughts. What were your first thoughts when the COVID pandemic started?
The very first time that I started hearing about any reference point to this virus, Lisa, was early as 2019 in December. I recall I was ready to board a flight from Kansas City, and they began talking about, all the news monitors in the airport began talking about this strange mystery virus that had surfaced in China, and then especially related to Wuhan. And I thought that was, to me, very interesting because of the fact that China, we know from history and disease outbreak epidemiology, there's a history of things like the avian influenza, things like the SARS virus, the early coronaviruses that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. And the other thing that came to my mind I thought was very interesting that nobody was talking about was, as early as 2013, my bioterrorism preparedness planning unit was involved with conducting some of the largest exercises, global pandemic exercises, here in the North Texas area. And guess what? When I say exercise, for individuals, let's say military or emergency management, you do this exercise based upon a worst case scenario. And at that time, we were doing these exercises, and they all followed a playbook, a situational playbook. And get this, it involved a novel virus coming out of China. Secondly, exercising control protocols to contain that virus. Not only that, but how we would even go to the standpoint of dealing with news media, casting and crafting media language, shutdowns, mandates. We were talking about it as early as 2013. And I remember some of these exercises are very large. We were conducting one at the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, not too far from here, where we took entire 727s, full exercises, with multiple agencies, and we actually practiced and discussed how we would do lockdowns of entire flights, passenger manifest crews, all of that.
Gosh.
And so what is interesting is that all of this, we might use the word pandemic, I talk about it in my book, you know, it had all the appearances of these links, and again, a novel virus coming out of China, but nobody was talking about that, Lisa.
Wow.
You have a lot of experience,
Yes.
doesn't he? You have so much studying and fighting bioterrorism. What are some of the signs that made you think that this could have been a bioweapon?
Renee, probably some of the most, I'd say probably the three elements. One I would address are the peculiar properties of the spike protein of the SARS-CoV virus. We have all been bombarded with those media images, knowing what the COVID virus looks like, called coronavirus, obviously the spikes of a crown image.
Yes.
I was going to say it's ugly. It's very
Yeah,
ugly.
It is.
The spikes on the ball.
Yes, there's spikes on a ball. As
far as my
Great
medical
way to
training
look
goes.
at it. But the thing about it, this particular virus, the very unusual properties in the sense that the spike protein signature with those crowns were able to really attach themselves so easily to membrane linings in the nose and especially in the lungs, the mucous membranes in the lungs, and they would almost like just latch in to the cellular structure. And I remember some of the scientists that were looking at these unusual spike protein properties we're talking about, these seem to be almost as if they were enhanced or created to have this resiliency about it. So that's the second element, I would say. These very resilient properties of the virus. And if you look at viruses from a normal construct, let's say seasonal influenza, that virus, flu virus, has about 250 typical genetic signatures or patterns in its construct. However, when we look at the SARS-CoV virus, we see this enhanced signature that there are these properties where it has such a high yield of transmission for infection, for causing death. And also we began looking at and asking the question about why is it being spun off in so many multifaceted variants there, which was unusual for the early, if you take any novel virus, whether it's avian influenza and you look at the epidemiology history, avian or swine flu, whatever it is, it's highly unusual that a virus would be that evolved in such a short period of time. So I began asking some of those questions. A researcher, whom I quote extensively in my book, his field is genetics, his name is Dr. Stephen Quay, was also asking questions about this virus. And one of the things he began doing is running an analysis on the earliest known viral templates that came out of Wuhan. And he used what was called a Bayesian analysis, a genetic Bayesian analysis. He used a supercomputer, ran the DNA sequences through the computer, high-speed profile, looking at the computer, and it came up with three very significant things. The first one was that the virus actually had some genetic links to an earlier, what we call an alpha-beta, I'll talk about in a little bit, alpha-beta SARS coronavirus that was discovered as early as 2013. The other thing that he found was that there was definite cross-contamination. And I'll explain a little bit about it. If you're working in a research lab, I worked in BSL level 3 labs here in North Texas, and then yet the level 4 lab in Wuhan. So this would be at the highest level. when you're working with viral pathogens, there's not supposed to be any cross-contamination, but he began suspecting there had to be intentional cross-contamination.
Wow.
And he found, guess what? The evidence of an early experimental vaccine, mRNA vaccine. The third thing that really raised my eyebrows working in the bioterrorism world was that they found the presence of a very deadly Category C bioengineered virus called a Nipah virus. Now, a Nipah virus is genetically created, is genetically enhanced, but it even is 25 to 30 times even more deadly than the average alpha-beta coronavirus. So that in his eye, he said, there is no doubt in my mind, after he completed his research, and I quoted over 250, 300 pages of research with Dr. Quay, he says, there's no question in my mind that this virus here was genetically enhanced.
Wow. That's scary.
I know, to think that's been going on, you know, and that you've seen a lot of that happening in the past, or, you know, have done some just experiments, and all of a sudden this is just, you know, happened to come out. Why do you think that this virus was genetically engineered?
Well, there are several leads on this as we began looking at, I mentioned Dr. Quay's Bayesian analysis when he's looking at the genetic templates of the virus. He found a component known as RAT-G13, RAT-G13, that linked it to very early forms, very basic forms of the called alpha-beta coronaviruses as early as 2013. And the reason why I refer to that is that there was an incident that occurred in 2013 in the Hunan province of China. There was an abandoned copper mine that the government decided to reactivate. So 6 miners were given the very unpleasant task of going deep into the mine shafts. And they had to clean up all of the bat fecal matter, scrub it from the ceilings, the floors, and the walls. And of course, that particular cave had what was known as the horseshoe cave-dwelling bat, very common in China. And they began scrubbing all these walls. Within 12 hours, less than 24 hours, all 6 miners become very ill with a strange respiratory virus, these symptoms. Wow. 3 of the miners, they're hospitalized immediately. 3 of the 6 miners die within 24 hours.
Do you
now,
believe that?
Dr. Shea Zhengli, who is actually the director of research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the WIV, the Wuhan lab, her background is in bat coronaviruses. So that really got Dr. Zhengli's attention. She sent in research teams, and they began extracting samples of bat fecal matter from bats. And in that period of time, that began the very earliest gain-of-function research projects, where they began taking those early alpha-beta coronaviruses, and they began, what's gain-of-function research? You begin enhancing the viral properties and enhancing them to the extent where they have a greater yield of infection. Wow. They're more deadly. And Dr. Zhengli began working with, it was Dr. Ralph Barrick. He is one of the chief researchers at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And they began taking these bat coronaviruses, splicing them into the backbones of mice. Why were they doing that? Well, obviously a virus has to have a living biological host to replicate. So they spliced them into the backbones of mice and began replicating them. And not only that, began enhancing the genetic properties, began altering the genetic properties. We know this because institutions such as Texas A&M in Galveston were recruiting as many as 40 research scientists from Wuhan, training them in genetic splicing techniques. Now, genetic splicing is actually, that's a category C bioagent creating. So you actually have the perfect recipes for creating. You begin looking at asking the questions, and these were things that were not being addressed in the early outset of the pandemic.
So as you said, Wuhan was a level 4. That sounds like a very secure lab to me. It must be a higher level. And so what do you know about the Wuhan lab? And what are the odds that this could have been, how could it be accidentally leaked, really? I mean, it couldn't have been an accident, right? Or what do you think?
Lisa, that's a great question. And with things that are coming forward now that we know of, with research scientists, whistleblowers, we began looking at the lab. And a BSL level 4 lab is the highest level that is the lab that works for the most deadly pathogens, biopathogens. There are 2 of them here in the United States. One of them is the CDC. My staff and colleagues, we went to the CDC lab for training. The other is Fort Detrick, Maryland, which is associated with the military. Well, this level 4 lab in Wuhan, some red flags started coming up very early on. I began seeing one of them was right before the pandemic, a General Shen Wei, who happens to be a member of the People's Liberation Army in China, and she is the leading, get this, she's the leading subject matter expert in bioweapons development. So why is she suddenly being assigned to a lab, that's supposedly be involved in humanitarian research? So whenever you see the military involved, some questions automatically should come up, but they were never addressed. The other thing was that in September of 2019, just a few months before we heard anything about the COVID pandemic, you had one of the largest military exercises, global pandemic response exercises, was conducted, guess where? It was conducted in Wuhan, just a few months before the pandemic. Okay, now, so you begin asking these questions. Well, is it more than a coincidence? I believe certainly they were. And the Wuhan military exercise, they exercised all of the things dealing with lockdowns, vaccine logistics, deployment, mandates. Guess what? The whole ball of wax that I was telling you about, that we were actually doing joint exercises back to 2013, Wuhan was doing a full military exercise. Wow. Then, get this, right after that exercise is conducted, in October of 2019, the World Military Games are conducted in Wuhan. Now, this is a very large, it's like the Olympics, the International Olympics, except it involves military service members. Over 9,000 military service members from 109 nations around the world. Wow. They show up to compete at the World Military Games, and it's being conducted where? In Wuhan. Now, within a matter of a couple of weeks, most of these are military athletes in top peak physical condition. Within less than a couple of weeks of many of these service members returning to 109 nations all around the world, they began exhibiting these very strange respiratory symptoms. Oh, God. And I recall talking to an epidemiologist asking the question, why was this not on our radar? And so you put all of this together, there were some really strange things going on that really brought the Wuhan lab to the forefront on my radar. After the military games, right after that, there were these huge blackouts. We have satellite geospatial data that shows these huge blackouts occurring right in Wuhan and in the Hubei province. And they're media blackouts, everything's really strange. And then, not only that, the Wuhan lab, this level 4 lab, has one of the world's largest repositories of viral templates, database, huge database.
Wow.
Over 40,000 viral templates.
That's a database I don't want to get into.
And this is suddenly taken offline in the middle of the night, no explanation at all. So things are just not adding up. If you look, and asking about the lab, Do I think it was just an accidental release? I think all this has been planned for months, if not years.
Well, and then what's your theory on why the UN World Health Organization didn't act quickly? You know, what is your theory about that?
You know, the United Nations, obviously the World Health Organization, a component of the UN, it's amazing because from the very beginning, the World Health kept telling the public, and as a matter of fact, as late as December 31st, that was earmark date on the calendar for Wuhan because we had over the first 200 initial source cases okay, that we know of on record. And they kept saying, hey, China has all this under control. They're a level 4 lab. There's nothing to worry about. They have this contained. While cases were actually exploding at an exponential rate. The average epidemiologist would look at this and say, wait a minute, Houston, we have a problem here. Yeah. Why isn't the World Health? Why are they so reluctant to address this? As a matter of fact, it wasn't until late March 2020 that we had this thing blowing up, exploding, that they decided to issue a pandemic declaration. Okay, so, and then on top of that, the thing that really irked me about the UN and the World Health Organization was that they had decided, because of pressure from the public and the international community, they decided, okay, we're going to send in an investigation team to look at this. And from the very beginning, they denied that this came out of a lab. It has nothing to do with that level 4 lab. Yeah, even though they work with all these very deadly pathogens, yeah, don't even worry about the lab. It came out of a market. Somebody bought some bats, had some delicious bat soup. It was infected. And they were main proponents, World Health Organization and Communist China. This came out of a marketplace. And so they sent an investigation team, and right from the very beginning, I was dubious of that because of the fact that one American is assigned to that team. His name is Dr. Peter Daszak, who happens to be, he was the primary researcher that headed up the collaboration with the Wuhan lab.
Now you have a chapter in your book, it's called In the Aftermath of Wuhan, Deceit, Propaganda, and Control. How have you seen these three things interact since the pandemic?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, deceit. We've seen from the very beginning this very intentional lies and cover-up. The media did not want us to look into the lab. The lab was, it was right at ground zero, and the ground zero where this virus came from. So why were they so aggressive in covering it up and maintaining this false narrative that it came from naturally occurring viral pathogens out of the marketplace? So they began insisting from the very beginning. So I say the deceit, Lisa, is in that, the just intentional cover-up. The second area addressing is the propaganda aspect of it. Mainstream news media basically took over this entire role of maintaining the narrative. Nope, didn't come out of a lab. If you say it came out of a lab, you're anti-scientific or you're right-wing conspiracy theory. Okay.
Right.
Now, not to mention, there are a number of brilliant scientists and researchers. I mentioned Dr. Stephen Quay. I could name others, even physicians, medical physicians like Dr. Peter McCullough, Dr. Robert Malone, that were actually saying this is not adding up. They were censored by the media. And matter of fact, if anybody even attempted to challenge the narrative on Twitter or Facebook, you had basically the fact checkers would make their remarks slamming you for being anti-scientific. The third area you talk about, to me, is even worse in its implications, and that is the control matter. Because when we look at the control, all that was done in the control, we look at mass closures very early in the very beginning. It's interesting that, strip clubs and other places of business, big box stores, were not shut down, but yet churches were expected to shut down.
Right.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Why is that?
Yeah.
And then you begin looking at things like the mask mandates, okay? Fauci first came out, he backpedaled on this. He said, well, don't worry about wearing a mask, it's not going to do any good. And then the World Health Organization issues this huge mandate on masks and their efficacy. And then he changes the line, he says, well, if not one mask, even 3 will probably even be better. And then we're suddenly walking into these big box stores, and we see on the floors, we walk through the front door, you see these squares with a circle and an arrow saying 6 feet. Distance
Right.
yourself 6 feet. So, and then the rollout of vaccines. We like to believe we live in a free world, American republic, where I can make the decisions for my family, I can make the decisions for myself on what course of action I'm going to take for my health. Well, that totally went out the window. So you had suddenly these controls, okay? You get the vaccine. If you don't, matter of fact, nurses, doctors were being fired, employees were being terminated. So this whole control thing is even more scary.
Yeah, it seems like just a test project for the future, which I hope it's not, but just seems like they were testing it out with this virus.
Yeah.
Hey, we're out of time. It has been so fascinating,
Wow.
Dr. Fulmer. I wish we had more time. That we could take an hour on this subject. You've
Definitely.
been so inspirational and so interesting, telling us about all this, and I felt like I was just in a science lesson. I mean, you've really expanded my brain power, I think, because you've given us a lot of insight on what happened at Wuhan.
Yes.
So thank you so much. Dr. Fulmer's book is called The Wuhan Incident, Bioweapons and the Emerging Global Reset. You can find Dr. Fulmer at his website, wuhanincident.com.
And we hope you'll connect with us here at Pearls of Promise Ministries. You can email us at info@pearlsofpromiseministries.com. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter at Pop Talk Media or Instagram at Pop Talk Ministries. You can also find all of our past Pop Talk television shows on our Pearls of Promise YouTube channel.
And thank you to our sponsor, Prestige Development Properties, LLC. If you have a project that needs a commercial developer, Prestige Development Properties is the place to go. You can email Prestige at Kerry, Kerry, at Prestige, PRESTIGEDEV.net.
And we are grateful for all of our 14 Pop Talk television platforms, including our latest edition, the Creso Rain 24-hour gospel network. And thanks to our production team from Grace Point Media. For all of your media needs, go to gracepoint.media. That is it for this episode of Pop Talk. We're just ordinary girls
Who God turned into pearls. Enjoy your week.